welcome to another edition of the EPS podcast where everything is a primary source. And today I am going solo. It is the first time so far, other than the initial episode where I introduced the whole podcast, that I am just speaking off the top of my head about things and not bouncing ideas off of other people. But that's okay because what I'm going to be talking about today deals with the ultimate alone story when it comes to this time of the year, and that would be Home Alone, but not the John Hughes movie. Instead, today I'll be analyzing the Home Alone novelization by Todd Strasser, based on the screenplay by John Hughes. This is a book that I've had right around the same time it came out, which, incidentally, was the first time I knew anything about the Home Alone story. I digress a little bit. I was very familiar with the movie Home Alone when it was coming out. In fact, I can vividly remember when I saw the trailer for the first time. I was just about 9, going on 10 years old, and actually maybe a little bit younger. And we had just arrived back from the store, the mall probably even, and as a family, and we just happened to turn on the TV in time to see Kevin McAllister pulling pranks on the burglars, Marv and Harry, and, sliding around his house, fist pumping and saying yes. And I remember that my indicator that this must be a good movie, that it's beyond just a regular slapstick comedy kind of thing, was the fact that my dad, who has a pretty discerning taste when it comes to comedy, actually chuckled and said, "That looks like a good movie." But in those days, late 1990, almost into 1991, we didn't really have a lot of money to go to the movie theaters, and so we never really did, and we never got to see Home Alone in the theater. And so I felt very much like Bart Simpson with the Itchy and Scratchy movie, in that I was resorted to purchasing the novelization at a Scholastic Book Fair at my school. And I was, attracted to the book cover right away because it shares pretty much the same thing, except for as the movie cover, except for the fact they put a word bubble over Kevin's head saying "Holy cow" as he's slapping his face with his hands in that iconic appearance. And I started reading it right away, and as I did, I had images in my head of the characters from what I'd seen in the previews, but I was also having to make up a lot of them my own because the book does take a different direction in a few cases compared to the movie does. And so I'm not really going to talk too much about the content of the movie or the book or both today, but instead talk about this particular item as a primary source. What does it tell us about late 80s in America? 1990 is actually part of the 80s. It's not the 90s because they hadn't happened yet, so it really can't be influenced by anything in the 90s if they're just taking place. Late 80s America, society, the economy, culture, different kinds of industries. That's what's going to be talked about today, and the evidence will be shining through the breakdown of this particular book. Maybe you have a copy, and if so, why not follow along and look about the things that I do? So the first question that always comes up when it comes to a primary source analysis is, what material is this made from? Well, a book, of course, has, it's paper, different kinds of paper, glossy. There's, the color photo on the front, and there's, the classic book type paper in the middle, bound all together. Those are the materials. They've been used for paperbacks all throughout, the entire history of paperbacks. But in another way, the material is John Hughes's movie script. And the movie script, you can find all sorts of videos explaining the origins of Home Alone, how connected it is to the movie Uncle Buck, where they noticed, young Macaulay Culkin, and, how, he had both the youthful charm, but also a little bit of wisdom, beyond his years. There's a particular part in the movie where, while guarding the house, he opens up the letter box or the slit in the door to see. It turns out it's imagination, but it's a bunch of burglars' faces looking in, and he gets shocked. And so that from there they came up with the idea for Home Alone. And Ultimately, though, it really stems from something that was pretty common throughout the 80s and even the 70s before it, and that was latchkey kids. That kids coming home from school to either empty homes or with their siblings and having to fend for themselves. And the reason for that was because their parents either were from, they just had one parent household and the parent was at work all day trying to make ends meet, or both parents having to put food on the table were also away from home, or because I think I've mentioned in other podcasts on this same topic, certainly by the 80s, it had become not strange for a woman to pursue her own career just based on her own desire to have a career of her own. So having an empty household created an entire generation of kids who were either going to daycares after school, or if they were old enough, or the parents felt the neighborhood was sound enough that they could just end up at home and for a few hours fend for themselves. And I really think that that is part of the reason why this story really was able to be generated in the first place. It would be, although a bit ridiculous at some points, how Kevin gets lost in the mix in the entire, rushing around before Christmas time, that it's not impossible that he would have been forgotten about. But also, just in general, kids having to, not just curl up and be scared, but, rely on their own wits when things don't go exactly as planned. And latchkey kids had that advantage. And then the book is based on a screenplay, which was translated into novel format, and of course, like I said, published and printed. And what I find interesting about that, and what it tells me as I look at it, first of all, is that the first Scholastic printing. This was made by Scholastic Books, and it says right on the cover, based on the hilarious new comedy from 20th Century Fox. You look at the information on the publishing page, and not only does it give a fair warning that I am not to be reading any of this over the podcast, which didn't exist in 1991 when this book was published, but not to be photocopied, not to be electronically sent somehow in 1991. Send it through the telegraph, any piece of it without contacting Scholastic ahead of time. But it's copyrighted also 20th Century Fox Film Corporation. But the book itself, this is first Scholastic printing, and I assume Scholastic's the only ones that had their hands on this. Was in January of 1991, so a few months after the movie had come out. I can only imagine, under the "how was it made" question, I can only imagine that this was being written as a novelization by Todd Strasser simultaneously with the movie being produced. And that's evidenced through some of the changes or the things that were deleted in the movie that are in the book. Some of the descriptions of things or the behavior of the characters. There are scenes that are hinted at in the movie but are come alive in the book. In fact, when I first and finally saw the movie a few months later, because in those days we didn't have streaming, and if my family wasn't about to go to the theater, we didn't also have HBO at that time, so we had to wait almost a whole year until Home Alone came out on VHS to start watching it. I started to compare and contrast. I said, wow, the book talks about the scene where Kevin is trying to dupe the burglars to thinking there's a party going on at his house with a pretty simple combination of some of his mother's mannequins, because she's a clothing designer, and himself playing the piano intentionally poorly with some kind of laugh box thing at his side that he opens every time he makes a mistake. The movie's far more elaborate than that in the way that he tries to drive off Marvin Harry. So that's one of the differences that tells me that they must have been, putting both of these things together at the same time. And I have almost every indication that tells me that the reason why it didn't start showing up in book form until January of 1991 was because they wanted to wait and see just what a big hit this was for the theater. It was the audience, the target audience for this particular story, are kids in their, just below 10 years old and just above 10 years old. 10, I think, being the median age of interest in this. And so wanting to see some feedback, and feedback they got because after a little while of that movie being in the theater, I remember hearing stories about standing room only at the movies to see Home Alone. And they had these promo commercials, showing kids coming out of the theater saying, "I've seen Home Alone 9 times. I've seen Home Alone 15 times." And I was sitting there saying, "Well, I haven't seen it. I've seen it 0 times." So when the book came out, I was finally glad to be part of the conversation as kids were talking about everything. But it tells me, the fact that it was printed not until January after that Christmas was that they didn't really know. They wanted to test the waters a little bit before they had said, "Go ahead and let's start the merchandising process." So, it's I'm sure it was something that was already in development, and further evidence of that. I didn't realize this is true, but the author, and that's one of the next questions is who made it. The author Todd Strasser, who uh, is you've probably seen his books before. I'll put it that way. When doing a little bit of research on Todd Strasser, I came to find out that he has written over 140 books for primarily youth audiences, young people, young adults, and including a series of books that he became popular for over in Germany. And there's one book in particular called The Wave, which is mentioned in the opening pages of the Home Alone book that I'm looking at, that he had written under a pen name by the name of Morton Rue, excuse me. And that was it's when you look it up online, it makes it seem like that was a book that was completely his own, and it was made eventually into a movie in Germany in 2008, and that was based on a series of socio-psychological experiments in Palo Alto, California in the 60s. But it turns out that his book, Die Welle, if I'm saying it right, was actually based on a 1981 television movie by the name of The Wave. And so he took the telecast, the teleplay, and turned that into a book in 1981, which then was made into a book later on, which then had a movie made out of it. So it seems to be that writer Todd Strasser, a lot of his work, and inside of Home Alone, it mentions books by Todd Strasser, The Mall from Outer Space, The Complete Computer Popularity Program, Friends Till the End, The Wave, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. That last one also threw me for a loop for two reasons. One, another John Hughes movie that was turned into a book, and the fact that they made that movie, which it's definitely an older audience than Home Alone, into a young adult book. I suppose very similar themes between the two of having fantasy for young people of being able to dupe the adults and go live your life as you please without any supervision and have all these tricks up your sleeve. I mean, Ferris doesn't go so far as making traps for his parents to fall into, or even Ed Rooney, but he does have a series of gadgets that helps him get his way out of going to school in that era. But as far as who made it, Todd Strasser is just one layer of this. Seems to be that this tells me that throughout the 1980s, 90s in particular, because he doesn't start getting recognized as an author until and getting awards until the 2000s and beyond. But in that era, writing, being an author, was a full time job. And it wasn't something that you could just, and that's true for today too. It's not something exclusive to that era. I think a lot of people wrongly assume that everybody's a Dan Brown, everybody's a J.K. Rowling, that all you have to do is write one hit book or one hit series and you can live off that the rest of your life. I think that most writers, that they're very, just nose to the grindstone, trying to find projects all the time. And if somebody says, "Hey, can you turn this movie script or TV script into a book?" they do it because that's a way to maybe pay a few months mortgage or something like that. So Was definitely a full-time job. Now, the other people who made this, and it makes it, entirely clear on the cover of the book, a novelization by Todd Strasser based on the screenplay by John Hughes. So John Hughes, that's the same John Hughes that you're familiar with from The Breakfast Club, from Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, from the National Lampoon movies, the vacation movies, from Vacation, Christmas Vacation. Vacation in particular was actually a story first, a short story that he'd written, and then turned into a movie. But by this point, John Hughes' name, by the time he writes Home Alone and then turned into a book, was synonymous with comedy movies with poignancy, things that are funny, relatable, and he definitely had built his career based on those things, and made some fantastic movies along the way. So by the late '80s and to the early '90s, just having John Hughes' name communicated a lot. For a kid's book, intentionally the lettering of his name and the author is pretty small. The words "Home Alone" are huge on the cover, and Kevin, who's 10 years old in the movie, or 9 years old, Macaulay Culkin's face is of course taking up most of the cover of the book. So for the intended audience of this, which was mainly school age kids, they're not too concerned with John Hughes or even Scholastic, which is the third layer of who made it. They're more concerned with, oh, there's Macaulay Culkin, there's Kevin from Home Alone. I'm interested in getting this book, and so the formatting of all this, the lettering on it, tells me that kids were more interested in the social status of Kevin McAllister, Macaulay Culkin, who I recall the following year was in a movie called My Girl, and that was the marketing for My Girl was based entirely on the success of Home Alone. He plays a supporting role in that movie, yet they announced the movie, they plugged it by saying Mac is back and showing glimpses of Kevin McAllister, or excuse me, Macaulay Culkin from My Girl. And, it's kind of a strange thing to do because that movie has literally nothing to do with Home Alone. I digress for just one moment. I wanted to also point out that there were a series of other books based on movies that Todd Strasser had taken part in, and that includes the book versions of The Pagemaster, another Macaulay Culkin starring movie turned book, and The Good Son, which has Macaulay Culkin. The Good Son in particular has been described, and I think accurately, as a more realistic version of Home Alone. Kevin McAllister, if you change the tone of that movie just slightly, turns into a sociopath. He's almost a antisocial, really creepy kid with the kinds of things that he does in Home Alone to prank and to hurt. It's beyond just defending his house. He really goes all after the two burglars. And if you've seen The Good Son, you recognize that the kid in that he plays is doing a lot of the same things along the same line at least. But because it's portrayed as more of a horror movie, a suspense movie, it works differently. So it's interesting that this same author, who did a fun, I'm assuming the Good Son book was not sold at book fairs everywhere from Scholastic. I'm assuming it was something that was more aimed for adults or older kids. But so that's something else I should mention about who made it and what it tells us. Now, Scholastic would be the third answer for the who likely made this particular primary source, this book. Scholastic had been around for a while by the time that this came out. In the 1920s, Scholastic was introduced as a magazine. It was just a few pages long, and it highlighted high schools in that era, and in particular sports programs. And as the decades wore on, by the 1940s, Scholastic had established a book club And by the 60s, they had gotten involved in the publishing business. And with publishing, they were, taking properties from both movies and TV shows, and of course original printings. They also started printing the classics and publishing those and getting those out there. In the 70s, they started to dabble in their own TV entertainment, and I've seen a few of those TV shows that, at the ending during the credits, it'll say Scholastic involved in it. And it was in the 1980s, right? The tail end of that time period is when I picked up my copy of this. That they started to get involved in the book fairs, and I'm sure we all, those of us who, and they still do it, grew up in the 80s and beyond, remember the excitement of seeing those giant silver cases on wheels being rolled into the school and placed in heavy traffic areas like outside the library, or in the case of my school, outside the cafeteria. So on our way in and out of the cafeteria to get our food, we would see all these books, and then our teachers would always bring us a special trip. Bring in your money, bring in your checks. Special trip to the book fair, and I think that in itself. So why did they make this? Well, reading the story as a way to support and merchandise for Home Alone. Scholastic, when they have their book fairs, they share. They get, of course, they're doing their profit from selling the books. That's why they choose the titles that they do to sell. But they also share in that money with the schools. So the schools do make some money, and it goes usually to their library or other reading programs at the school. And so when deciding what titles Scholastic wants to put up there, having a story, the novelization of Home Alone, or I think it was the following year or two that I picked up a nearly identical looking book off the same shelf at the book fair, Hook, the Hook book. It was not so much, it was partly merchandising, but also just recognizing that kids, as much as you might try to keep them away from screens, that is their easy go to. And if you're going to try to sell a book to them, they're going to want to be interested in something that they're familiar with otherwise, that they have some interest in outside. It's going to be really hard, especially by the end of the 80s, to try to, push on them Robinson Crusoe or Treasure Island. As exciting as those movies are, you're going to want to base things on movies. It brings to mind another book, kind of a combination of those two stories. I remember picking up at the book fair once again, or maybe I ordered it through one of those tissue thin flyers, but it was the book version of the Disney movie Shipwrecked. And one thing that this book, Home Alone, does not have, which I find interesting and maybe very telling, that so many of those other novelizations of movies did in the time period, was an insert or a section in the middle of glossy color photos from the movie. This one doesn't have that, and I'm curious if that goes back to my theory from before, in that maybe the movie wasn't quite done yet when they decided to go ahead and give the go ahead to the book, because it comes out so soon afterwards that they were being made simultaneously, with the big question of, will this be a hit or will it not be? So while merchandising was growing, kids still didn't have as much access to money or to the stores, so they wouldn't really be able to go onto their own to a store. In most cases in that time period, merchandising for movies in particular was limited to things like action figures. As far as I know, they never had that for Home Alone. It'd be kind of a weird line to have in the first place. Video games, which they did have, definitely for the second one. I'm pretty sure for the first one as well. But even those were not usually purchased by kids themselves, because they didn't have $60 laying around that they could just go and buy something like that with. They had to resort to their parents and ask them to buy things. Parents are always much more willing to buy books. And so, there was a little bit of freedom when the book fair was coming to your school, because you might get a check for $15 from your parents or even less. And you'd have that shopping experience of being able to go around the metal cases and weigh your options and see how many erasers that look like strawberries you can have, and posters of jet fighters and things like that. And okay, now I also have enough for these three books and a bunch of other things. Having to make those decisions, and that's something that is pretty telling of the time period. And in some ways, I wonder if it's a precursor to pouring rights. That Scholastic having a monopoly over selling books in schools is similar to the kinds of agreements that came about not long afterwards, and maybe even simultaneously, of companies like Pepsi and Coke getting involved with school districts and setting up their machines in their schools that only they could have there. And in turn for selling only their product, and schools did this at different levels of different degrees. They would either promote the product sometimes, because they had quotas to fill, where principals were making announcements like "Don't forget to buy your Pepsi," or by telling kids who were wearing competing T-shirts to remove their shirt to cover them up, just so that they could get things like scoreboards or uniforms for the teams paid for, instead of having to turn to taxpayers for it. This is an era where that long history in the United States of having a trust but distrust relationship with all things government and taxation and authority was not slowing down. It wasn't changing at all, and so I'm sure that looking for ways to raise funds in a more creative way was something that was reflected in things like pouring rights and even the Scholastic Book Fair. Just a theory on that one. Now, the next question that comes up when analyzing a primary source is where was it made? The book itself was published, like a lot of books do or are, in New York City. So it was Scholastic. Well, Scholastic has lots of different branches all around the world: New York, Toronto, London, Auckland, Sydney, but also New York is where I assume this one was at least given the go ahead, if not the actual book itself printed from there. The particular copy that I have in my hand right now is not something that I have owned. It's not my copy from years ago. Instead, I'm not even sure where I picked this up. I may have ordered it just on a whim some years ago from one of the online book trading sites, or I may have picked it up at a Salvation Army or a thrift store somewhere, just as a fun thing. But when I opened up the book this morning, after deciding this is what I wanted to do for today's podcast, I came across a note that was handwritten back, I assume, right around 1991, by a girl in Utah. And she has her name in there. It says, if found, call, and then gives a full phone number, or return to, and gives a full address with, in cursive, very nice handwriting, doing a good job with the lessons in school. A big thank you and several smiles underneath. So, it's, I think, yeah, I mean, not only is it a very sweet thing to see that this book was not something, because, looking at the price of the book at the time, $2.75. $2.75, you can spend that much on a fountain drink at a store nowadays. It's not a lot of money. But what this tells me about the time period is that kids were an emerging market in so many areas, in so many ways, not just in film, not just in television, books. I mean, this is something that had been going on for some time. The demographics of target audiences had been getting younger and younger since the 50s and the 60s. Kids are being catered to. The story itself is very kid centric, but also the merchandising, the books are very kid centric. But the fact that the owner of this book cared about it so much that, and coincidentally, because the story is about a kid who gets forgotten about, he gets left home alone, and is looking to be returned or having his parents returned to him. So I find that nice tie-in with the note on the front of the book. But this young person really cared so much about this possession that they could easily have bought a new one, probably, or at least went to one of their friends who picked it up at the same book fair. But they really wanted to make it part their own set of possessions. It made a lot of meaning to them. And so possessions, even easily replaced ones like this one, had a lot of much more importance to children in that era. Uh, they weren't necessarily all, surrounded by things that they loved. That you couldn't just go to stores, or definitely couldn't even go online. The internet didn't exist yet, at least not in a commercial way, and just reorder something that you missed out on or misplaced. You had to take care of your belongings, and so that attitude, those values, really were strongly put into kids' minds, and that's very clear by the personalization of this particular copy. And I find it very nice. And once I'm done using this as a primary source, I may very well try to track down this person who's probably a peer of mine as far as age, and see if I can get this book back to her and let her know that it's been found. Take a moment to dry the tear that just rolled down your cheek. So, I mentioned already many times over, the intended audience or user of this particular thing was the very person that bought it and other kids just like her, boys and girls, around the same age as Kevin. The story of Home Alone is not just as simple as latchkey kids. It's the idea of, and the ideas and behaviors that's conveyed throughout the movie is there's it's many layers of it, and the book speaks to this as well. Of course, that kids really in every time period, but definitely in an age like the 1980s, really could find themselves lost in the mix. They could be found to, with all the busyness around them, ever growing busyness around them all the time, that it was not uncommon for a kid to feel forgotten about, to have no one to turn to, nobody to talk to, being chased out of every room because they're in the way, feeling that they're being dumped on by anybody who is stressed out about this, that, or the other. And so that's how the story starts in Home Alone. And as the time goes on, as the story goes, as we are very familiar with it, kid power comes up. The idea of kids being able to handle things on their own and being able to take on challenges. And this was not a new thing. By the time Home Alone came out, we had seen it before in various other commercial properties, including The Goonies. That stands out to me. Even Ferris Bueller's Day Off, like I mentioned before, has a lot to do with that idea. Of course, he's an older kid, so it's not quite the same thing. He can drive, for instance, whereas Kevin and other kids of the late 80s and early 90s movies that took from that same theme couldn't drive, and so they had to find other ways around not being in the way, but rather making themselves the destiny, they're the masters of their own destiny. It was a pretty amazing time. Now, the book itself, going back to this particular primary source and looking at it that way, not so much the movie. Unlike movies, books are not to be enjoyed by more than one person at one time. Of course, if this book was distributed in wide amounts, it's perfectly possible that every kid is reading it at basically the same pace as each other. But when reading the words, you're invited into a book so much differently than you are into a movie. You get to identify closer with the characters. You can read things over again without having to interrupt things by rewinding like you would on a VHS tape. And you could skip ahead if you're already familiar with something. You can, it's not really an isolating behavior to read, but it can be in a nice way very much a thing to do when you're alone to pass the time, to get entertainment, to get enjoyment out of it, and to feel very, very special. So not only does the story itself do a nice job of making kids feel special by making them the main characters, to tell them that yes, somebody understands you and somebody cares about you. The book does the same thing too, even more so, because this is not a book that was made for any other audience but kids in, say, fourth, fifth grade. You can see it from the size of the font to the wording that the author uses to get things across. It's nothing too much older than them. It'd honestly be a very weird book if it was written for an adult audience in that kind of language. It's about a kid, for kids, and this is, again, telling us so much more about the role of children in society in the late 80s, early 90s, and in the economy as well. Finally, the last thing on any primary source that needs to be talked about and looked at is whether or not it is descriptive or prescriptive. And I this is kind of a tough one for a book, uh, especially one that's based on something. I suppose in a way it is descriptive of the screenplay that it has to describe in the text. It fills in a lot of spaces. I've actually gotten enjoyment of reading other novelizations of movies. It's an interesting thing to consider that, of course, movies being a fairly new medium, only about 100 years old, that it makes perfect sense that the first waves of movies had books as their source material, books or stories, folklore that had been around for some time. That taking those kinds of things and putting them onto the screen, and in a way being the deciders of these are what the characters look like, these are what the scenes are to be interpreted as for a wide audience. It's not like a play that is put on slightly differently night after night, or depending on where it's being performed by different actors with their own take on it. Film tells you, it decides for you, it describes to you what is going to be the way of things when it comes to that particular story. But as the movie era continued on, this book acts as a testament to this back and forth, this kind of strange exchange that was going on over the years, in which it's is it a movie first, is it a book first? So many times people say, "Well, I don't want to watch the movie. I've read the book. The book's great," or they'll ask that question: "Is it better than the book? Better than the movie?" This is a reverse of that, where you can say, "Well, I watched the movie. Is the book based on the movie as good as the movie?" It's a funny thing, and that's something that was happening a lot. And it wasn't anything new by the time this book came out. In fact, right next to this on my shelf was a book version of the early 60s movie The Parent Trap, the Disney movie. And I believe that one was also a Scholastic enterprise as well. But it's not as new as this particular series. The book fair, that was something relatively new. Selling it to kids right in the school building, that was something relatively new. But by the time this one came out, but it's an interesting dynamic to think about how just in this one simple book is so much of a story of, not only just the story of Kevin and his family forgetting about him and him having to fend off burglars from his house, but the story of where do we get stories from? Who is you know, the grand storytellers? Todd Strasser, I'm sure he's a great writer. He didn't come up with the story. He tells it in a slightly different way. But John Hughes came up with the story. And as we continue on, it should be mentioned that Home Alone has turned into a franchise, a dynasty, in a way. We'll go back to franchise. In that there's been sequels and remakes. There's a recent one that just came out at the time of this recording, that I think called Home Sweet Home Alone or something like that, that has been panned by critics and fans alike, beyond, I think, what anybody would have imagined. Uh, I'm not sure if they make books out of those anymore. I know Home Alone 2 had a book, a novelization of it. In 2015, there was a picture book made out of the story of Home Alone, but it's just a very strange dynamic to think about. This constant chicken and egg thing going back and forth when it comes to storytelling, and that is a testament just to the era that we live in. Well, there it is for me, from me. I think if I had somebody else to talk to, I'd be able to stretch this out a little bit further. But considering that it's just me, home alone, I think I came up with a pretty good way of explaining how this particular copy, the novelization of the 1990 film Home Alone, that was published in 1991, is a just another way to get to know the time period. And so I appreciate listening. Please visit the website, epspodcast.club. It's perfectly reasonable that that's how you heard the podcast in the first place. stumbling across that site. But if you haven't been there yet, please do. Check it out. Contact me. There's also a Facebook group, by being found by EPS Podcast on Facebook. I'll be opening things up on Instagram as well soon enough. So if you have any suggestions for anything pop culture, whether it's another book, a record, a movie, a wrapper from some kind of candy, anything at all that fits into that category of mainstream popular culture type stuff, pass along the idea to me. I'm glad to take it on and see what it tells us about the time period and the people behind it. Until next time, thank you for joining the EPS Podcast, where everything, including the novelization of Home Alone, is a primary source.